It begins in stillness, not the stillness of a cool morning or the hush of night, but a deeper quiet, the kind that comes when the river draws in its breath and holds it for longer than you expect. You stand at the edge of the bank where the water should be, and you see instead a long curve of damp earth cracked in places, shining faintly in the early light. The air smells different without the wide body of the Nile close by. It is sharper, dustier, as though the wind has traveled further without the blessing of moisture. The reeds lean, but do not whisper, and the boats rest awkwardly against the mud. Their ropes slack in a way that makes you think of sleep without dreams. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not simply an inconvenience, it was a test. They had always lived by the rhythm of the river, marking the year by its rise and fall, by the black silt it left in its generous season. When it withheld its drift, every moment, every breath had to change. They began earlier in the day, before the heat made the air heavy and the ground hard beneath their feet. Water that once filled wide channels was now gathered from smaller, more secret places, shallow pools hidden in the shade of rocks, trickles feeding from springs known only to a few. The jars they carried felt heavier, not because of their weight, but because of the care each drop demanded. They moved differently when water ran low. There was less of the casual pouring to wash the hands, more of the deliberate dampening of cloth that touched the face and neck. Linen garments were rinsed in the cooler hours, then wrung tightly so that not a thread more water than necessary was lost to the air. Children learned quickly not to spill. They drank in slow swallows, letting each sip rest in the mouth before it slipped down the throat. Even the animals were taught to wait their turn. Donkeys and goats brought to the trough in quiet order, each dipping their heads without pushing the others aside. Shade became more than comfort. It became a reservoir in its own way. Palm leaf shelters were extended. Reed beds hung in archways so that the sun's reach stopped well short of the courtyards. In the thick-walled homes, clay jars stood in the darkest corners, their surfaces beaded faintly with the coolness they preserved inside. Here, water tasted of patience, cool but not cold, carrying a faint memory of play and the long stillness in which it had waited. When the Nile's edge retreated, eyes turned to canals and ditches carved over generations. Some were still fed by what remained of the river's slow current. Others came alive through the careful labors of hands, carrying water in jars to fill one section so it could feed another. You could hear the work in the soft splash of pouring, in the quiet commands passed from one person to the next, in the scrape of clay against stone. There was no hurry. Haste spilled more than it saved. And when the land itself asked for relief, they listened. Fields that had always drunk deeply from the river were planted with less, rows of crops spaced wider, giving each room to take what it could from the soil. Some crops were left to rest altogether, their seeds stored away for seasons when the Nile's gift returned in fall. Those who knew the old ways gathered moisture from the air at night, placing wide bowls under the open sky, so that the faint dew might gather and slip down their curves. It was never much, but even a little water, gathered faithfully, could mean the difference between withering and enduring. In the markets, the conversations changed. Grain was measured more carefully, prices shifting, not just for food but for the water needed to prepare it. People exchanged not coins alone, but favors and promises, help in the field for a share of the next filling of the jars. No one wasted breath on complaints. The air itself felt too precious to carry such words. When water ran dry, they turned also to the river's memory. Wells dug in earlier years, shallow but lined with stone, might still hold a little moisture in their deepest shadows. The youngest were sent to draw it, not because the work was easy, but because their smaller bodies could slip into the cool recesses without strain. The water was heavier here, carrying it with the weight of sand and time, but it was clean enough and it was life enough. The day reshaped itself in the absence of abundance. Morning paths leaned towards movement, walking farther to the surviving pools, crawling into the shade of low overhangs to fill jars with the water that clung there like a secret. Midday narrowed to essentials. Doors were kept half closed, courtyards shaded more thoroughly, speech soft, steps deliberate. Evening brought a long exhale. The air loosened and the world felt less stern, and in that gentler light, there was time to plan for tomorrow's careful sips. Inside the homes, water discipline became a kind of tender art. A cloth dampened just enough to draw heat from the skin, pressed to the hollow of the throat, the wrists, the places where the pulse runs nearest to the air. A small bowl kept for washing the eyes, used with cupped palms and closed lashes, the relief nearly ceremonial. Jars rotated through the rooms as if they were living things, moved along the day's path of coolest corners, first under the northern wall in the morning, then to the shaded niche as the sun turned, then to the inner room where the night's breath lingered longest. The animals too learned a new pace. Goats stood patiently in the shared shadow of a palm trunk, their hooves stirring the dust only now and then. Cats discovered the thin strip of coolness beneath a jar and stretched themselves there in two elegant parentheses. A donkey lowered its head, waited, and drank without hurry. The sound of it, soft and private, grateful, was a hymn for the day. Temples offered another kind of coolness. Within the high stone rooms, the air was not cold, but it was held. Light entered in narrow bands that fell across carved signs like streams across rock. There, water was more than utility. It was a presence and symbol and comfort all at once. Libations poured in slow, careful arcs, first for honoring, then later for thirst. Frankincense rose like white threads toward the shadowed ceilings. Each curl a measure of time counted without sound. On some days, a small caravan returned from farther upstream with sacks of grain and clay water skins that sweated in the shade. Neighbors gathered to share the burden of carrying and the relief of having. These returns were never noisy. Relief here had a quiet face. A cup passed from hand to hand, lips touched and lifted, eyes closed with that particular gratitude that belongs to warm places and cool water. One learned to drink, not to satiety, but to enough, enough to keep thought clear, footsteps steady, work possible, patience intact. And there were nights, even in scarcity, when festivals found their way into the courtyards. Oil lamps burned low to make their fuel last, and the music kept a slower beat, almost as if it too wanted to conserve. Dates were eaten one by one, each sweetness stretched into several breaths. Laughter came like breezes, light, infrequent, but unmistakably themselves. Children fell asleep against their mothers' sides, faces cooled by the night, and the storytellers drew out their endings to leave listeners suspended, so they might drift into dreams before the words were entirely finished. There were also tiny inventions that no one wrote down because they felt like breathing. A reed stopper carved to fit the jar perfectly so water would not lose itself to air. A quill-thin channel scratched into the lip of a bowl. A quill-thin channel scratched into the lip of a bowl, so each drip would know the path of least waste. A woven sling to carry two jars close to the body, where they would ride in the shadow of the carrier's shape. A mat hung at a deliberate angle to persuade the noon sun to pass by a doorway rather than pour through it. A whitewashed inner wall to bounce what little light was needed. while taking none of the day's coolness away. These were not inventions of pride but of welcome, ways of saying to the day, "We see you, and we will live with you." When water thinned, bread changed its mind too. Dough was softer and rested longer, and it surrendered to the hand without arguing. Loaves were smaller so ovens did not need to burn as long. Flatbreads warmed on glazed surfaces rather than deep within coals. Salt was measured more carefully, not just for the taste, but for how it taught thirst to appear slower. Cucumbers were sliced thinner and kept in shade until they were eaten, so their coolness remained a promise fulfilled at the last moment. People walked farther at dawn, when the ground still offered up the night-saved coolness, and the air could be borrowed before day fully claimed it. They followed old paths towards places where water lingered. Depressions where reeds refused to give up their green. Shallow basins carved into rocks by flooding long gone, but not forgotten. At these places, conversation turned to gesture and gaze. At low water, words felt too heavy. Hands took turns. Cups met lips. A few drops fell to earth for those who were not present, or for whatever unseen companion watched over the path. It was the kind of courtesy that survived in hard seasons, because it belongs to the heart and not the jar. You could see the change in children's play. They learned to carry small amounts without spilling. One palm curved into a cup, the other hand steadying the wrist so the arm's light tremble became a gentle tide rather than a splash. They buried a little bowl in cool sand and returned to it later to find water waiting, patient as a sleeping cat. They raced not across wide spaces but between shadows, discovering shortcuts that made the town a friendly maze. Their laughter, when it came, fell into the air like bright seeds. The day took them and made them grow into the comfort everyone needed. Even the sky offered small mercies. Before dawn, a thin dew spread itself like a rumor along reed mats and the rims of bowls. Women rose quietly to gather it with cloth, bringing it into a waiting vessel, no bounty but a thread, and threads woven together can dress a day. On certain evenings, a wind from far away carried the taste of water on its back. You could not drink it, but you could taste it, and somehow that was enough to keep the chest open and the pace unhurried. There were elders who remembered another dry season, how long it lasted, what returned first, who kept the best secrets of water and shade. Their stories were practical and soothing in equal parts. Go to the well behind the third grove at noon. The shadow there is longer than it looks. Place your jar on the northern side of the room at night. The dawn will not reach it as quickly. Do not drink when you're angry, for anger makes thirst grow deep. Drink after you have been kind. Kindness makes water sweet. Advice like this moves through a household the way a faint breeze does, and if you hold your breath, you might feel it pass from room to room, leaving everything the smallest measure cooler. In the long afternoons, when even flies conceded the shade, the town performed its quiet theater of patience. A scribe leaned his back against the cool wall and let the reed pen rest in a shallow dish, so that the ink would not dry before the thought did. A potter covered a half-formed bowl with a damp cloth and brushed the edges with fingers that remembered every curve. A carpenter planted wood under a roof where light filtered green through palm leaves, the scent of resin and dust achieving something like peace. Heat droned outside like a distant singer. Inside, time moved in wider circles. Sometimes a cloud formed over the desert, thin, insubstantial but dignified, and the town looked up as one. No one asked it to rain. Such hope would have felt loud. They only watched, and watching was like drinking with the ice. On rare afternoons, a handful of drops fell, darkening dust in soft, expanding circles. People did not run. They stood with their faces lifted, and the rain stitched coolness into their foreheads and wrists. left a damp thread behind the ears, and disappeared with a courtesy that felt like a promise rather than a tease. And then one morning,